So my name is Mary Moshokbayadeyemi. I am Nigerian, lived in the UK 18 years this year that I've lived in the UK. Came to the UK to study and then stayed and built a really great career in financial services. I currently work for Goldman Sachs and I lead our credit risk team for technology, media, and telecoms, as well as consumer retail and healthcare. So a really big platform, but it means I get to do really interesting different things every single day. And I kind of always say like I walk this really interesting tightrope of business, and this career with a lot of social pursuits. One being visibility. Through my career, I've had the opportunity to spend thousands of hours, creating or executing junior talent programs, and that really built up this passion in me for early careers, especially those from ethnic minority backgrounds who, like, I think I represent, being a double minority in the workplace in the UK. And that passion then led to me founding Visibility in 2019. And Visibility, as Tracy had mentioned, we are a social first organization that is really working to improve the outcomes for Black women in the marketplace. And we do that through inspiration, coaching, community, and advocacy. What does that actually mean specifically is that we spend a lot of time running inspirational career programs and events, specifically target at women, Black women, women of color, however you want to be. We're very inclusive, so we tend to have very mixed events, which is great. We also deliver career coaching programs. We have an active community of women as well. And then I work with a lot of organizations consulting on how to create spaces where women, in particular women of color, can really thrive. So I'll probably preface the conversation by really talking a little bit about what this concept of mental health is. I think sometimes the language that we use maybe in some ways perhaps even permeates the problem that we see in terms of people being stigmatized by it. So, like the WHO, to the World Health Organization, they have defined, formally mental health as this sort of state of well-being where an individual, so think about yourself, where you are able to realize your own abilities, cope with the normal stresses of life, whatever normal is in your world, where you can work productively and fruitfully and also contribute to your community. It's a bit of a long-winded definition, but I think what they're trying to capture is that this looks very different for different people. And in effect is, are you mentally able to connect with the work that you're doing, the natural, like the stimulus that is coming at you? Are you able to disseminate, make decisions, and things like that? I think, when we now think about sort of mental illness, and then maybe mental disorder as you walk through the spectrum, that's when you pretty much have the absence of all of those things I just talked about. And so, on this spectrum are sort of the things that are like maybe anxiety, mood swings, depression, but then also now down to the other end of more clinically diagnosed matters, like potentially some developmental disorders like autism, clinical depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, psychosis, that type of thing. Um, as it pertains to the workplace, I would say some of the biggest trigger for mental unwellness, I wouldn't even say illness, I think it's just mental unwellness, is what we call burnout, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I when I think personally, I think we are always, all of us, every single day, we are always on the ebb and flow, or shall I say the peak and trough of mental wellness or unwellness, because we have all sorts of stimulus coming at us. It's an emotional thing as well. And so for every single day when we flip flop between emotions, there is the opportunity for us to feel mentally well or unwell. So just kind of how we think about our physical health, that is also happening just mentally. And I think we've come, I wouldn't say full circle, but we've come a long way to acknowledging the importance of mental health vis-a-vis physical health, in society in general, and in particular in the workplace. There has actually been a few incidents, right? So if I think about what I mentioned, like we're constantly ebbing and flowing, but the big breaks are the ones that we remember, and I call them the incidents, the breaks. So one for me was like, and this was the first one I could really put my finger on, was 2014. It was really burnout. I had years of just progressive exhaustion. I'd been working really hard. I'd been studying all of my life at this point. I started school at 8, graduated my master's at 21, really didn't stop, apart from maybe the summer holidays or whatever. And being a very type A, sort of very goal-oriented person, I was constantly doing one thing or the other. So even during the summers, I would do summer school. There was just never like downtime. It wasn't something that was permitted in my home. And so that was just sort of you just go, go, go. And then when I started my career, I started in the middle of a crisis. That in itself was just extremely traumatic as an experience. You know, you start, people don't have time to train you, people are leaving or getting fired every single day. That's not something like as a young professional, you know, you think that you're getting through it, but you're actually, you know, you're experiencing a little bit of trauma as you're going through that. I went through maybe about 8 managers in 6 years. It was just a lot of turmoil in my career. And I think about like the first few years of work, I was also studying part-time. I was trying to get my ACCA, my accounting qualification. And so every break I had was pretty much study leave. So that just lent itself to a lot of exhaustion. And I think from a family perspective, my dad was diagnosed with prostate cancer somewhere in that. My mom was diagnosed with high blood pressure and hypothyroidism, also known as Graves' disease. So sort of big medical issues in our home. And I lived abroad, and my parents lived in Nigeria. I lived in London. And then when you couple that with being an immigrant, I was on a visa, you know, all of those things meant different things, and added sort of different layers of pressure. And so effectively, the summary is like I just took too much on. Um, and it took me 6 years, really for many reasons, right? I had to sit and think about this. Like, why did it take you 6 years of just, you know, going through this rat race, as we call it, and for you stop to realize that there was something wrong? And there are a few reasons why that was the case. You know, for me, it was one, this sort of this myth of gratitude that I carried. Where like I felt, you know, I felt like if I complained, it meant that I wasn't grateful for what I had. And given the background that we come from, you know, being Black, being female, it's almost like every opportunity is like a unicorn opportunity. And so you have to really appreciate what you have. And then in particular in the crisis that we were in, I had I had people who had gone to school with who hadn't found jobs. I had those that had gone for training with who had lost their jobs. So it was sort of like, how do you feel? How do you even get to feel exhausted? Was really the question I had to, you know, ask myself. I didn't feel like I had the leeway or permission to even do that. So that was really for me one, the myth of gratitude. Second, I mentioned my visa, right? I wanted to make sure like I didn't do anything that was potentially going to put my job at risk. I mean, they were literally looking for heads to chop. And I was like, my head is chopped. That has many more implications for me than the average Brit because I had to pack up and go home. And home is not bad. You know, home is not bad, but it just wasn't part of the plan, right? I just had other plans and I didn't want to go home at the time. So those implications as well. I felt like I couldn't I've also felt I couldn't speak out. My parents didn't understand, you know, the point of mental illness or wellness. They didn't also have the language for it. And then I think about my background. My parents spent a lot of time in the public sector. Like they both did really well in their careers, but they spent a lot of time in the public sector. So the idea and the habits and the environment that we exist in a UK private sector financial services actually felt like hell to them. So they just didn't understand. And so when we would have conversations, those conversations ended up being very unhelpful. For me in particular, it was more like leave, quit, come back home. It was all the things that I didn't want to hear, rather than you know all of the ways I could cope. Um, you know, and then I guess maybe finally it would be like just the burden of just the minority. Like for me, I think and perhaps that was self-imposed, but it was more like, you know, hey, if you leave, you know, this can happen to you. Like if you leave, this is why they don't hire Black people. This is why they don't hire women. Like this is the story that I was telling myself, right? And so all of that adds this layer of you can't leave, this is not real, get on with it, suck it up, you'll be fine, and so on and so forth. And it just carried on for years. And really what broke the camel's back was simply the fact that I felt really physically ill. You know, and it wasn't a physical illness, it was just a mental illness that manifested in a physical illness. And you know, when I do my research now, I can really see like mental illness does lead to a reduction in your immune system, thus making you more susceptible to like regular sickness. I always had a cold, I had a perpetual cough, I wasn't sleeping, I had insomnia, I had a headache that won't go away, I had fogginess in my brain. So like it was really like physical symptoms, but it really started out with, you know, with the mental. And so I then had to go to the GP. GP was like, how are you coping? How are you living? Like get signed off. And I really I struggled with that decision. Took me a while. I had to get help from our occupational health team at the time. they were like, great, let's go, let's make it move. But I just couldn't really get it. I just felt like a failure. There was just a part of me that just really didn't understand what was happening. I was really challenged, and it was also a promotion year for me. I was a senior associate. I was going to be promoted to VP. It was a big year. I couldn't afford to be out of the office, right? So very, very difficult time. But in the end, I had to sort of accept that this is where I was. I spoke to my manager. He was really supportive, but to be fair, he was surprised because he didn't have any idea that I was going through all of that. He couldn't see there was no impact on my work. Like he couldn't see that despite all of these things, like I was still delivering, I was still performing, I was still present. So he didn't really understand where it was all coming from. But nevertheless, he was supportive, and I went off for 8 weeks. Of time, and it was, and maybe that kind of leads to then, like, when you have these symptoms and there are many, what do you do? So for me, they're kind of twofold. Is what is the immediate solution? For me, that was get out of the stressor, exit the place that gives you the stress. And that was me being out of work. I was laying in the sun, taking my meds, redefining my happy place, doing all of this like really interesting, cool stuff. I came back to Nigeria for a few weeks, the longest I had been in Nigeria since I relocated. Spent time with my family, which is like, really energizing. I'm an absolute daddy's girl. And so I spent a lot of time with my dad and all of that. And that really just, I slept a lot. Probably for the first 2 weeks, I think I did nothing else but sleep. But, eventually, the fog just started clearing. I just felt like I was able to think through and make decisions. I didn't have the anxiety that was, really plaguing me. The insomnia was resolved, which was great. And with sleep comes, a lot of productivity. I felt refreshed. I felt very optimistic. And then when I came back to work, I just felt very productive, and it was just great. I wanted to be in the office. I actually liked my colleagues again, even though they were really annoying before. But actually, I liked them. I was like, oh, you guys are cool. And so it was just a really good time to be away. And as for it being a promotion, yeah, I came in and I plugged back in. I was on a phased return back to work. I plugged back in, and I still got my promotion, right? And when you consider how long careers are, you realize like 8 weeks of time off, 4 weeks of time off, 12 weeks of time, even 6 months of time off is a blip in your career. And I think sometimes we really burden ourselves with just like, oh my God, 8 weeks is a long time, but it really isn't in the grand scheme of things. And I think I'll just encourage people to think about it in that way and really just think about it as a tiny, tiny blip in the trajectory of your career. And you owe it to yourself if you're feeling, if you have all of these symptoms and you're feeling that way, you owe it to yourself to really explore what is possible in terms of just taking that break you need and just, coming back to center. And I also remember like having this really weird burden of like indispensability, and it's just so it's so silly, where I felt like, oh my God, I am the sensei. I am the owner and the keeper of all knowledge in this place, and if I leave, everything is gonna collapse. But hey, I was away for 8 weeks and everyone was okay. Nothing broke, nothing happened. The clients were there, the work was there, people got on. All the files that I thought that nobody would find, they found a way to find it. Like everybody figured it out. So again, this sort of sense of like, oh my God, nothing's gonna happen when I'm not here. Like everything's actually gonna be fine. It's a little bit like ouch, because you kind of hope that people will miss you when you're gone. But this is the workplace, right? These are really smart people you work with. They're just gonna figure it out, and you're gonna be able to take the time you need in real peace, and then be able to plug back in when you can. I wouldn't necessarily say it's like that they have unique mental health challenges, but I think we have perhaps additional stressors. Um, if you remember the definition I talked about with the WHO is are you able to deal with the stresses of life? But our stresses perhaps look a little bit different, or are additive to perhaps the like whatever, and everyone else has their own thing, right? If I think about the white mom who has a disabled child, like that's a stressor. So I'm by no means trying to say like, oh my God, we have so many more issues, but the question is, what are some of the things that we perhaps face? So I would say like, definitely the cultural stigma, that, the fact that a lot of us come from households that are, African, Caribbean, that have that background, and this stuff doesn't happen where we're from, right? That's the position. This is how we grew up. And we didn't have the language, we didn't have the training, we didn't have the exposure. And so I think back to, having even back to when I was younger and I had certain kids in my class that were now in hindsight were probably on the autistic spectrum, but we just thought they were just out of their minds. But we didn't know what it was. I didn't know what it was. My parents didn't know what it was. They were just, they had maybe perhaps, some had or kids with ADHD that would jump around and be completely like all over the place. But we just called them disorderly and we put them in the naughty corner. And we had all of those things. And that's really the environment that we grew up in. And so we sadly missed the education on this piece, right? Will I say like that is completely gone? I wouldn't say it is. I think it's still very much there, at least in my culture. But there's definitely a lot more awareness. I think you're now seeing a lot more exposed parents who are now calling it out. We're now starting to see special needs schools being built in this area. But in general, the culture is one of this stuff doesn't happen. And also we have like a very big spiritual um we have a very big spiritual culture around us. So everything is like prayer. And so when something is going wrong, it's like you probably need deliverance. This is a little bit like that's sort of the way the mind, and it's just not the case. And in fact, it's now been officially recognized as an occupational phenomenon, like basically like a kind of disease. Um, it's huge and it's costing us a lot. Like I think I was reading a survey the other day, that Gallup, the guys who do the Clifton Strengths Finder, and they did a survey and the numbers were pretty high that 67% of people in the workplace have experienced burnout in their current job. More than half of which is say like you've had it more than once. There's been more than one occurrence of it. And then when you think about the millennial population, that number is like 84%, because the millennials and they're just not patient, right? We don't have the patience gene. So, these numbers are startling, when you think about the fact that this is now like being deemed to be a disease that, this state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion, that kind of leads to this, stress factors and then, emotional drainage and so on and so forth. So like I know we talk about it a lot, right? It's such a buzzword. We've seen the first of all just the rise in number of conversations about it, open, courageous conversations about burnout. Things like mental health first aiders have also been introduced in a lot of organizations. There's been a lot of focus, right? But one of the big things that I always sort of challenge, especially when I sit with organizations consulting and I say like, I understand you're prioritizing mental health by you prioritizing a mentally healthy organization, because you cannot just say like, this is what employees should be doing and take all the time you need and rest, sleep for 6 hours and exercise and do all of these things, but then you don't create an environment that actually allows that. So I think, we all need to, as an organization, as people managers and so on, we really need to look in the corners and figure out whether our organization is, fit for purpose and mentally healthy. So, do you have things like, do you have an always on work culture? This cell phone issue is a problem. Um, effectively because I leave the office, but have I really left? So those kind of things help, helping your people create boundaries. Knowing that, making sure we have a culture that is saying it's okay after a certain time, it's actually okay to be switched off. That's one thing. And then I think also, being able to clarify expectations really well with with a lot of your people. Many of us have second jobs. We have your core job, the job that was on the job description, and then we have the pluses. It's not necessarily like your core function. It's not necessarily why you're being paid. And so you clarifying like what those expectations are, and those second jobs, spreading things around. Resourcing is obviously a big thing. I know like many organizations have this sort of do more with less mantra, this lean workplace. You might be doing more with less as an organization, but you're not actually doing more with less. Your employees are paying the price for that more with less, because they are now doing more with the time, and 24 hours is 24 hours, right? So they are doing more with their time. So the organization might be getting more out of them, but it's costing them something. And so, and I know a lot of times people are like, okay, we're going to leverage technology and do this. we're going to like change everything and it's going to be great and we're going to replace X number of hours of headcounts and so on and so forth. But the fact is the rate at which digitalization really closes that gap is much slower than we think. And so making sure we have the adequate resources to do the work that we like, we kind of have one job that three people should be doing and one person is doing. Like that is not a mentally healthy environment. And then I think about things like, just unnecessary competition, within the organization, but also across the industry. Um, you know, when when we have lack of clarity in terms of how people are performance managed, how they're promoted, how they're hired, it's unclear. So people are just doing everything. It's a rat race. Like everyone's always running and competing against the next person when we really should be collaborating. But just having that again, clarity, opening things up, it just helps people not be anxious. Like, why would I come to work when I don't even know what the stakes are? Like, it feels ridiculous when I say that, but that's effectively where we most of us are existing in that environment. And I would also add, like when I mentioned like the industry, I think unfortunately our clients are not helping us. Like I'm a client service person, and I know when you're working for clients, it's just yeah, like you're pretty much switched on and you're working, all hours. But I think sometimes as an industry, we really should be thinking about, and please don't quote me outside, but we really should be thinking about maybe disciplining our clients in terms of like what is the right, if we're all in this together, if we all as a global society understand that mental health is a priority, then you as a client sending things at Friday evening at 5 at 4:59 for delivery on Monday is not helpful, right? And and then as an industry, when we think about the fact that this is now how we compete, it's the first to the line. So that means everybody's working. Everybody's working all weekend to get to first to the line. So I think as an industry as well, we've been able to come together to collaborate on so many things. This is one area that I feel like there should definitely be more collaboration. How do we as an industry work towards a better mentally healthy industry, like, and not just when we have the PR stunts when something wrong has really happened and then we're now trying to fix it. So I think, but just in general, as our just our base case, we need to have that. Like life is so important, like beyond the work, like where is the importance of life? And I know we have to serve our clients and do all these things, but there has to be a line, right? And a lot of times when people talk about these sort of you know um badge honoring moments of their career when they're in labor and they're on the client call, we don't chastise that. We, in fact, maybe celebrate it. And I think that then breeds the culture that says that that is what is supposed to be celebrated. Where, contrary, we should really be celebrating like mentally healthy choices, like leaving work on time and, having a few good hours of sleep and working out and having like, having a side, not maybe like a side hustle, but like having playing sports or doing something, we should encourage people to create boundaries and celebrate that. And then we should critically question when people are doing things that are not normal, right? If you have people who are constantly in the office till 6, as a manager or what, we should not just pat them on the back, but we should say like, what is it that you're doing that's causing you to be, here at that time, and how can we help you, right? I had one of those cases, and I'm not just talking about like there were times I had to deliver projects, and I literally slept at 6 o'clock. This was in the middle of the pandemic. I was working from home. I slept at 6 a.m. and I woke up for a meeting at 7, at like or like 8 a.m. or something like that. Because I had to catch up with Asia. I remember my manager saying, okay, I really, I applaud your dedication to the work, but why? Like, so he really had to call me out on that behavior, and that was a real learning moment for me. That, hey, that's not a badge of honor, right? So having that culture that really calls things out like that, I think is really, really helpful. So I know I've said a lot, but hopefully, people can glean some things out of there. If you are a I use this anecdote and everyone kind of laughs, but it is what it is. I'm gonna say it, like, if you're a wife, wives train their husbands and probably vice versa, and you train your kids, or partners. I know, we live in a world that's, you train your partners, whatever it is, you train people in terms of how do I want to be loved and cared for and dealt with. I think it's the same with managers, and unfortunately, I think because of this, of sort of the structures in our organizations, we see managers and just think that they know it all. We see our managers and expect them to have it all figured out because they have the manager title. But a lot of times, managers are just like maybe the best performing people in the team, and they're technically great, but they may not be great with the whole people management piece. I don't think it's always been, it should be, but it's not actually really the case. At least in my career, I've not really seen that where, the best people manager is who's doing the people management. It's always just like, this senior person and that senior person, and each of them gets three people. I'm not really sure there's particularly that much logic in terms of determining, and then you may just land with a really good mentor coach type manager, or you may just end up with someone who's just a functional leader, wants to do their job, wants to do that, and doesn't have any time for all those things. So I think regardless of wherever you land in that spectrum, it's important that as someone who is as a managee, you train your manager in terms of how to manage you. And by that's by, really open and perhaps maybe courageous conversations around like we have the expectation managed. Like the first conversation is, would you want me to communicate with you? And this is how I want to be communicated with. I think a lot of times we're always managing up, but sometimes we need to teach people to manage down with us, right? Like the other way. Like this is how because we are individuals too. We are worthy of the positions we're in, and so like train your manager, like giving your manager feedback, like this doesn't work, and not just when they ask for it, but like I noticed that you do this and you do that. Can you help me understand why you do this? And then is there something I should be learning? So I think that really the impetus of on an employee as someone who's being managed and us within a firm is to really have courageous conversations, tell people what we need. I keep on seeing this thing, and I'm always in two minds about it, around like this second job that a lot of ethnic minorities get in terms of training other people on the topic of bias and stuff. Is almost like we have this real issue but we don't want to talk about it, and I'm like, well, then who is gonna, like, there like at some point, whilst it creates a burden, there is a responsibility somewhat. If we want the change, then there is that responsibility to be the voice of the change we're seeking until we no longer need to be the voice of what we're seeking. So I would encourage people to, like, whilst it can be overwhelming, exhausting, and all of those things, we have to understand the place that we have as ethnic minorities, or or minorities in the workplace, to represent the views of the people till we see the change. Then we can back off. But I cannot be tired of having the conversation until there is no longer a problem. That is my position. Hopefully it's not a position that offends people, but if it does, that's okay too. But that's what I mean by there is a responsibility. It's not a single way, and we just have too many expectations of we expect so much without like communicating really what we want. So I would challenge you, like, as we think about tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, really think about where you may be making assumptions, or where you're making a decision without a conversation, and really try to address that in as adult and respectful a way as possible, but really, really try to address it, and then see like what happens. If the situation is the same after that, okay. But if the situation actually changes, then well done. That's a great conversation that now leads to change. So Visible Strengths is out in May. Touch wood. Visible Strength is out in May. I'm already pre-selling, so you can hit the pre-sale at visibility.com/visible strengths book. And I would ask Nagita to perhaps share that with the group if you wanna. It'd be great to have your support. So yeah, so it's been really good. We launched a pre-sale in December. We raised $10,000, just over $10,000 for the book. So it's actually been really, really good. And there's so many elements within the book that, a lot of the topics that there's a whole section on health in the book because it's so important to me. And I know that in order for people to contribute value in the organization, they need to be in a really balanced state of mind. And so that's why it was important that I included a chapter on health and shared my story that you've, had the opportunity to hear firsthand today. But then the others, I shared one. There have been like other incidences, like when my father died, and so many other things, and how I was dealing with that real time in the workplace, and of course with the pandemic and so on and so forth. So I share all of these stories in the book, in the chapter on health, as well as many other chapters on how to discover your strengths and apply them in the workplace, how to understand expectations and deliver, great value to your organization, and then how to communicate your results for effective visibility. And I really, really like, my goal for the book is that, those who are coming in, because that was where I had a bit of a tumultuous journey, is like those who are coming into the workplace, they know the stuff that they should do, and they're able to transition better in the workplace. But then also for those who are in the workplace and you just feel like things are not working, or you want to just have a recap and a reset, it's a great book to pick up as well. So yeah, so those are the contacts. And then in terms of just socials, I am at Visibility everywhere, and that's on LinkedIn, on Instagram. I'm not a Twitter person because I think Twitter is like hell. So no to Twitter, but definitely on LinkedIn, my company page, or even find me, just Mary Moshapra AME. You would find me with a cute picture, looking good. So you can add me, and yeah, if you add me and say Lazard events, I'm happy to connect and share all of these details with you as well.